Now, in a surprise move today, Christopher Watts has pleaded guilty to killing his pregnant wife, Shanann, and two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, and their unborn son, Nico.
Denver 7's Thomas Hompo was in the courtroom when a plea deal was announced that will put Chris Watts behind bars for life and avoid the possibility of the death penalty. Thomas, the DA says he made this deal with the blessings of Shanann's family, and they were there today.
The decision was made about 4 days ago. The final piece of the sentencing agreement calls for the district attorney's office, myself, to agree that as a result of his plea of guilty, that he will not face the death penalty. I know that there are going to be a lot of questions about that, so let me address that right up front.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. You heard at the beginning of the clip District Attorney Michael Rourke talking about reaching the decision to come to the plea deal 4 days prior to the date that he gave the press conference. So in other words, November 2nd. The value of this chronology comes through specifically in a case like this. It's not impossible to go back in time to figure this stuff out, but obviously laying down the chronology at the time also just shows, what one was thinking at the time and why, and most importantly, how the district attorney bamboozled everyone. They bamboozled the media, they bamboozled the public, they bamboozled Chris Watts, they bamboozled pretty much everyone. And you might say, well, if you want to be bamboozled, you're not bamboozled. But I don't know how many people are out there who think that this outcome suited anyone except the district attorney and Weld County. And I guess the interest associated with Weld County. Obviously, in this episode 16, in Christopher Watts' What Else Do We Know?, we are kicking off with November 2018, and we'll be looking at the first 10 points in November. November was a very big month in the Christopher Watts case. Before we get to that, if you're interested in the Chris Watts case and you'd like coverage of it from someone who's written a couple of books about it, you might want to subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, please share across your social media, especially Facebook, and leave a comment, and let's get started. Right, so the first point in the November section of the chronology is if Chris Watts is found not guilty, it's extremely likely Shanann Watts' family would file a civil lawsuit alleging he's responsible for a wrongful death. Denver Post. So this particular article came out prior to the announcement of any. At this point, everyone was assuming there was going to be a preliminary hearing on the 19th of November. So people and the media were gearing up to the beginnings of a criminal trial, sort of kicking off 3 weeks from the beginning of November. To be accurate, this particular article actually was published on the last day of October. And what is interesting is that the Denver Post was actually ruminating about the possibility of no conviction. On that date when the Denver Post article came out, I wonder if they knew or sniffed something about the possibility of there not being a court case, because there wasn't a court case. If there had been a court case, I don't think there's much chance that Chris Watts would have gotten off lightly. I think he may have gotten off better than the plea deal that he got, but I don't think he would have gotten off very lightly. Now, before we continue with the timeline, it's probably important to just emphasize that by now Ashley Banfield was basically off the air. HLN wasn't really covering the Chris Watts case. So by early November, HLN were sort of just not involved, right? And then that is when all of this was announced. Wouldn't you say that's quite an interesting coincidence? Is HLN and Ashley Banfield, who've been covering this case bumper to bumper, they disappear, and in that vacuum, suddenly there's this announcement, oh, we're now going to schedule a hearing. And by the way, we're not going to say anything about it. It's no big deal. We're also going to schedule the hearing on the same day as the midterm elections. Nothing funny about that either. And of course, the background to all of that was also the whole thing of the autopsy reports. The coroner had said he's going to stand by the district attorney and he's going to fight for against the release of the autopsy reports, even though the court had not opposed the release of it, and also the defense, Chris Watts' defense, had initially not opposed the release of the autopsy reports. Point number 2 in the chronology refers to an article in the Greeley Tribune published on November the 2nd, 2018. And the headline read, Frederick homicide suspect Chris Watts to appear Tuesday, which was November 6th, in Weld District Court. Kind of a bland, generic headline, right? Just Chris Watts is going to appear on Tuesday in court. If we go to the article, it refers to the Weld District Attorney's Office announced late Friday that Frederick triple murder suspect Christopher Watts will appear Tuesday for a status conference. The hearing is scheduled for 30 minutes beginning at 2 p.m. in Division 17. The District Attorney's Office didn't release any other information. I love that. I just love how bland it is. It's so boring, and not only this, but it is. This came out late on Friday. So this announcement was late on Friday when everyone's gone home and everyone's sort of gearing up for the weekend. Do you think that's a coincidence? Do you think this announcement, basically that we're going to have a court hearing, which was for the plea deal, one of the biggest legal milestones of the Chris Watts case, do you think the announcement late on Friday was just a coincidence? That just happened to be the timing? Do you think the scheduling of the trial on November 6th, the same day as the midterms, was just a coincidence? And if you think about the bland headline and also the blandness of this whole thing, there's going to be a 30-minute hearing. And you could almost imagine the press saying, I think we're going to give a pass on that. I mean, it's probably just going to be a mere formality, right? I think that's what the District Attorney's Office were hoping for, that this would just sort of pass the media by, or that most of the media wouldn't particularly care about it. Certainly this announcement, which had to be made, was made at a time they were also hoping for minimum interest, late on a Friday. And when the Greeley Tribune asked the District Attorney's Office for more context, they just wouldn't give any, right? And then there's a little bit more color here where the Greeley Tribune says, Watts wasn't scheduled to return to court until 10:30 on November 19th. So you've got a very unusual thing here. Often if people who know true crime and people who know the law and criminal cases, you tend to see 99 times out of 100, you tend to see court cases delayed or postponed. You virtually never see the opposite. You never see a reverse to that, where all the lawyers want to get together earlier than what they originally said. It's very seldom that that happens. And what is also interesting is I was studying, like a lot of people following this case, I was studying the online docket. I was studying the, the Weld County motions online, and so was everybody else. And November 19th still remained on the docket as of Friday afternoon. So, in other words, even though they changed this date, someone who happened to miss this particular announcement would still possibly assume that the November 19th proceeding was going to be the next sort of milestone. Or they may have assumed, oh, well, this is some sort of nonsensical, trivial matter, and the November the 19th is when one needs to sort of pencil into your diary that, that's what's necessary. And what was quite clever was the November 19th date did remain a court date, and that was when they had the sentencing, instead of the preliminary hearing. So at the time I wrote, is it just bad luck that this hearing has been moved to the same day the US media will be preoccupied with the midterm elections? In true crime, there's no such thing. So I obviously suspected something was going on here. I kind of had a gut feel all along that something like the John Benet Ramsey trial was going to happen with this case as well. I couldn't quite say why. I just sort of thought, I don't know if I trust the prosecutors in this case. I just don't know, in terms of prosecuting it in a totally transparent, totally normal way, where someone's committed a crime and now you're going to have a trial. I just sort of thought, I know one would just expect that to happen, but something tells me it's not going to happen. And I felt that all along with the Chris Watts case. It didn't make any sense because I thought Chris Watts doesn't have any money, doesn't really have a reputation to protect, unlike the Ramseys. So what possible forces could there be that would stand in the way of a trial? And of course there were forces standing in the way of a trial. According to CBS Denver, also reporting on the same thing, the District Attorney's Office did not release why the status hearing was moved to an earlier date. So the media were obviously asking, okay, so what's going on here? And the District Attorney's Office wouldn't say. Number 3, speculation continues to swirl around Tuesday's court appearance. Is Watts going to be offered a plea bargain? So basically my very next point after this was in the news was, is there going to be a plea deal? And so I said, or is the hearing simply time to avoid a tsunami of news coverage? Or is it just a random scheduling change? And if you followed the links that I placed in that particular point 3, it went to blogs on Crime Rocket, such as Chris Watts, a plea deal is definitely on the cards, which was published on November 4th. I wasn't the only one speculating about it. There were other people on Facebook as well. And anyway, you can go and look at those articles. I actually screen grabbed articles about the Boulder DA and about Stan Garnett and about John Benet Ramsey. So that was very much at the top of my mind at the time. And you can go and look at the article. It's basically also just talking about the oil and gas aspects in Weld County. Also that on February the 4th, 2018, Weld County was poised to see a record year in oil production. Of course, at this point, we didn't really know whether what was going on with Anadarko, that they were being wooed by oil majors at the time. If you go to the bottom of the article, this particular article was only shared 6 times. So people weren't really interested in this. So I don't think they took it necessarily that seriously. I think they were also sort of, on the weekend. I think the 4th was a Sunday. So I don't think people even really noticed. On Twitter, some people were saying this smells like a plea deal. So on November the 3rd, there was a little bit of speculation that this was a plea deal as well. And again, not much response to it. I see one particular tweet was liked once in terms of a plea deal. Number 4, Judge Kopkow denies motion for expanded media coverage. And at that point, I pondered sort of, is this unusual? And I linked that to a blog post as well. At the time I wrote, on the face of it, pre-trial hearings aren't usually televised. And this is something I wrote on November 6th prior to the actual trial. Or the actual, hearing for that day. And so what I said is, advisements and arraignments are televised. So the whole thing was, okay, we're not going to give expanded media coverage to this because it's not usually televised, so it's no big deal. But the thing is, it wasn't what it was pretending to be. And so if you think about it, all the hearings in the Chris Watts case were televised, right? All of them. There were, in total, I think there were 4. I'm talking about specifically related to the criminal aspect, not the civil trial. So all 4 hearings there were 4 hearings, and 3 of them were televised. The 2 in August, and the last one on November 19th, the sentencing hearing. Arguably the most important of all of them, the one on November 6th, wasn't televised, the plea deal. Clever, wasn't it? Even so, there was an incredible amount of media interest in this apparently no big deal hearing, and so you kind of had the Colorado Judicial Branch website blowing up on the 5th with requests for expanded media coverage from 9 News, from KCNC, from Denver 7, from the Coloradoan, from the Associated Press, Longmont Times Call, and so on and so on. And it just goes on and on and on. Fox 21, KUSA, and so on. So if you go to that particular article, that was shared 60 times. So there was a little bit of interest from the readers of Crime Rocket that, wow, it looks like something could be brewing here. Is this a conspiracy or is something actually going on? You can read the article just about how unusual is this kind of expanded media coverage. And I remember during the Patrick Frazee trial, expanded media coverage wasn't allowed either. And that kind of made sense, but for completely different, I wouldn't say completely different reasons, but for different reasons. In that case, you had a witness who had entered into a plea deal, and she probably demanded a certain amount of protection from the media. There was that aspect, and then there was also the pragmatics of the court. The Teller-County Court was kind of quite small and a very old building. Personally, I think that was just an excuse not to have the media present. But that was another case where there was the denial of expanded media coverage. So I would say when there's a possibility of the outcome being jeopardized, then, and there's not a very strong, anyway, let me just keep it simple. When there's a possibility of the outcome being jeopardized, then expanded media coverage is not allowed or is denied. I'll put links to all these blog posts that I put up at the time in the description, so you can go and look at them if you're interested. It's just a bit of background around the legal process and that sort of thing. Then point number 5 actually deals with November 6th. So what was quite interesting here was there wasn't really any news. There was just basically there's some kind of announcement, and that there's going to be a court appearance, and then nothing. And then there was literally just nothing going on in the news, no one really talking about anything, the media not even thinking about anything. Of course, the media, I think, suspected something, but they weren't saying it out loud themselves. So point number 5 really dealt with what happened on November 6th. And this is what I wrote at the time. TCRS, as you'd expect, called the plea deal long before anyone else did. In the lead up to the hearing, TCRS posted several blogs on the issue. When the hearing commenced just prior to the official announcement by the media, TCRS called it once again. Within 2 minutes of this tweet, Carol McKinley and all the other media followed suit and made it official. You might think that's blowing one's trumpet, but I think it's just sometimes just important to establish who called a particular outcome prior to it happening. And I do think it's important to be able to do that, because it's showing that you know what's going on. You know, you've got your finger on the pulse kind of thing. I don't think it's actually accurate to say that True Crime Rocket Science called the plea deal before anyone else did, as in any other individual. I think there were a couple of individuals on Facebook that I found. I mean, I was obviously looking to see what people were saying, and I found the odd tweet here and the odd Facebook comment there, but no one really seemed to be worrying about it a lot. There were 1 or 2 exceptions, but there wasn't really that much concern about it. As far as I know, in terms of the big commentators, the well-known commentators on the Chris Watts case, True Crime Rocket Science was the first to kind of publish extensive posts just saying a plea deal is on the cards or whatever. I didn't see anything like that anywhere else. And if you look at the post I put up on November 4th, which was, I think, the Sunday, as I say, it was only shared something like 4 times, 6 times. That's nothing. In other words, people didn't really even notice it. Then on November 5th, the next day, which I believe was a Monday, Scott Reich put up a video where he basically confirmed what I'd already said. He basically said the following, and you can go to the blog on Crime Rocket, Chris Watts Deal or No Deal ? And it's just a short blog with his video in it and what he says. And he basically said, and I can tell you as a practicing attorney, when we add a case on like this, oftentimes it is set for a change of plea. Somebody wants to enter a plea. Is this what this is set for? He says, I have no idea, but usually if you add a case on early, if there's going to be a plea, you want to do it strike while everything is hot, so to speak. And your client and the defendant wants to plead guilty ultimately. So he says it would be curious to see if maybe the DAs have told Mr. Watts and his counsel this is the offer, and maybe he accepted it. But then he sort of adds, or it can be as simple as rescheduling. And this was shared 8 times. Bear in mind, these are some of the biggest moments in the Chris Watts case, and just from the sharing of these particular posts, it just shows you it didn't really, people weren't really interested, and they didn't really seem to care or realize what was kind of going on. True Crime Rocket Science was also the first to tweet that there was a plea deal. If you check the timestamp of the tweet, it was about 1 minute before CBS Denver. And obviously the timestamp on there is local time, that's South African time. But I felt pretty chuffed about that. Carol McKinley tweeted shortly after that Chris Watts reaches a plea deal. I think the media suspected it all along, but I think they have different protocols where they can't speculate in advance, because they could potentially get into trouble and also be barred from attending. So anyway, point number 6 is the written waiver and guilty plea. You can go and look at that if you haven't seen it before, if you want to be reminded. One thing, I sometimes get criticized on YouTube where people say Chris Watts is guilty of killing 4 people. You know, it's sometimes I refer to him as a triple murderer, because that is the way the law recognizes him. And obviously I'm aware that he is also guilty of the unlawful termination of Nico, right, the unborn child. But the law, according to the law, he's guilty of triple murder. And to every single time say triple murder, or to say quadruple murder is factually not correct. It's legally not correct. And so obviously I'm aware that, you know, obviously it's bad enough that he killed 3 people. He also killed a 4th person kind of in the making, right? But anyway, in this guilty plea, you can see that he's found guilty of 3 charges of murder in the first degree, and then 1 of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. It's important to bear that in mind. When I say something like, Chris Watts, the triple murderer, I'm not trying to minimize Nico's murder or Nico's death. I'm trying to just be accurate in what I'm talking about. And I mean accurate in terms of the law. But I do understand people who say, well, you know what, he did actually kill 4 people, not 3. Yes, but one can't, to say that every single time you refer to him. And I just know that this is going to cause a lot of people to pounce on this particular thing. But anyway, go for it. Number 7, District Attorney Michael Rourke reveals knowledge of a partial motive. I think that was what he said at the press conference. You can go and have a look at that as well if you're interested. What is quite interesting is they didn't really say what that partial motive was. I think at the sentencing hearing they did, where he spoke about wanting another life. I think what he is angling at in terms of that is he was sort of saying that the reason that he wanted this better life with Kissinger was part of the motive, but the other part was something else. And I don't know whether they didn't know or pretended not to know, but the other part definitely had to do with the finances. That is a big part of why I felt like he couldn't get a divorce. But interestingly, during the sentencing, Rourke kind of said, all of us have financial problems. So he was very dismissive of the financial problems, which I thought was not necessarily true. Of course, I don't think Kissinger and the financial problems are the entire motive either. I think there are other aspects that are relevant as well. Point number 8, Nicole Atkinson posts a message on Facebook on the day of the trial forgiving Chris Watts. I like Nicole Atkinson. I think she's very down to earth and a sweet lady. But I don't approve of people forgiving publicly in the middle of a trial. I don't approve of that. I think it's fine if you feel that way. It's fine if you tell the people you love that, but you shouldn't make a public spectacle of it. And the reason is, it's the court's job to decide whether to forgive somebody. And if someone associated with a victim says something like, I forgive you, then the court is almost like hamstrung in a way. The court is almost like in a position of, wow, okay, so should I not give a very excessive sentence? Should I let this person off? If I'm doing what the community wants me to do, does the community want to give clemency, or does the community want to forgive this person? And I'll give you a very good example of this, where it actually had a bearing on the outcome. I covered the Oscar Pistorius case. I was in court. I met the family members. I spoke to the prosecutor even. I wrote quite a few books about it. I spoke to Oscar's agent. I got pretty involved in that case. And when Oscar was found guilty, and it was sort of between him being found guilty and being sentenced, the victim's mother said that she forgives Oscar. And during the sentencing hearing, the judge actually brought this up. And that is where it's a problem. And the mother of the victim didn't even testify, even though I think she would have been an excellent witness. But I think if she had testified, I think the defense attorney would have just grilled her on, but haven't you forgiven Oscar? And so instead, the father testified, and you could see he didn't forgive Oscar, and he wasn't happy. And he basically demonstrated in court how he would plunge needles into parts of his body where his daughter had been shot to feel the reality of what she felt, to acknowledge that. And he also wanted the world to acknowledge what she'd suffered, because she'd been lost in the whole story. And he even wanted photos of her post-mortem, in other words, photos of her at the crime scene. He asked for them to be published. He wanted people to see them. He wanted people to see what had happened to his child. And so all I'm saying is, when you extend clemency, maybe it's good for you. Maybe you feel nice about it. But in terms of the legal process, it doesn't do anybody any favors. Literally, it doesn't do anybody any favors. So while I understand Nicole Atkinson's position, and I think she's, as I say, a nice person, it's not the time or the place to say things like that on Facebook in the middle of a trial. And this is when this actually happened, prior to sentencing. It's a no-no. And, you know, another way of looking at it is, if Shanann Watts could have sort of come out of the grave, just like any other victim, I don't know whether she would have extended clemency to Chris Watts. I don't know if she would have said, I forgive him. Honestly. I mean, would you, if you were murdered and there was a trial about to happen, would you want someone to say, well, I forgive my murderer, or a family member, or your friends? I mean, if you do, great, it's nice, but look where you are. You're in the dirt, you're in the ground, your life's over because of this person. I mean, a crime is despicable and dirty and ugly, and what Chris Watts especially so. And you might say forgiving someone is very, very nice, it's even saintly. But often you need to take a lot of time and feel that forgiveness rather than just say it. That's just my opinion. How do you guys feel about it? Number 9, the media have already started applying for expanded media coverage of the sentencing hearing set for November 19th at 10. So on the same day as the plea deal, which was on the 6th of November, the media were now applying to get their seat in court for the 19th. And that was probably the biggest day that was televised, compared to the plea deal, which was sort of swept away by the midterms and kind of the confusion and all that kind of thing. Point number 10, Chris Watts was angry at having to plead guilty to murders of pregnant wife, daughters, CNN. And I think that's quite interesting. In the literature, I'm not sure if it's Cadle's book or in the Discovery or both, but Chris Watts spoke about being asked hundreds of times by his defense lawyers if he wanted to take the plea deal. I'm not going to go through the chronology any further. Points 11 and onwards deal with the issues leading up to the sentencing hearing. It's a lot to do with Cindy Watts's reaction and her husband and how they felt about this surprise thing. And so we'll talk about that in episode 17. Just a final few things I want to mention. One is that what does Rourke mean when he said, we came to this decision 4 days ago? And bear in mind, he said this at a press conference after the plea deal was announced on November 6th. So 4 days before that was November 2nd, right? But we know that a letter or an email was sent from Watts's defense lawyer, John Walsh, dated August 26, 2018, with a timestamp of 11:58, and the email reads, to Steve Wren, who is the deputy district attorney. Subject: Chris Watts. Dear Detective Wren, the defendant Christopher Watts is willing to agree to waive his rights to be indicted and to plead guilty to all charges of first-degree murder charges if our office is willing to remove the possibility of the death penalty. Best, John Walsh. So this plea deal was actually in the offing as early as less than 2 weeks after the murders. So 13 days after the murders, it was already, the plea deal was already on the cards. We also know that the district attorneys flew to meet the Ruseks in North Carolina and spoke about being in their kitchen and talking about everything. And that definitely all didn't play out until the 2nd of November. So I'm not quite sure, maybe you could technically say that they officially decided, in other words, they officially handed in the paperwork on November 2nd. But to say that, that this was like a recent decision and it was sort of caught them by surprise, I don't think is accurate. I really don't think, in a way that the media was surprised, in a way that the public was surprised, I don't think the district attorney was surprised. I think the district attorney had been playing with this card all along. And also Chris Watts' defense lawyers. And if you bear in mind that there was that September 1st, 2017 search by Nicole Kessinger that came up in the Discovery, and then the district attorney was asked, what are you going to do about this? Are you going to investigate Nicole Kessinger? And his response was, and this was on November 28th, so this is quite late in the game. Sorry, not the 28th, December the 10th, was Chris Watts' guilty plea has precluded any need to further probe the results. So we've closed the case. We're not going to talk about anything. We're not going to do anything. We're washing our hands from this case. We don't know all the answers, and we don't really want to know all the answers. So thank you, goodbye, the show's over. And of course, this aspect was shared 331 times. By now, people were quite up in arms, like, what is going on? Why have we been played? What's something's going on? But these people were aware of this after the fact, rather than kind of aware of it before it was happening. And this, I won't say it was an announcement, but it was revealed kind of indirectly in the program Family Man, Family Murderer. So although the date wasn't explicitly mentioned, the email was sort of quickly shown in the documentary, and if you had an eagle eye, you would sort of have caught it. So even though the district attorney gave away this information, it was just slipped into the narrative kind of through the back door. And anyway, and this happened in, I think, June 2019. June 4th, 2019 was when I wrote about this particular thing. So almost a year after the fact, this was finally revealed, and as I say, not obviously revealed, revealed sort of quite subtly. And so what I wrote at the time was, the other aspect to note is if the date is right and the plea deal was offered on August 26th, consider how long the media and the public were strung along. The plea deal was only acknowledged in a surprise announcement on November 6th. So we actually only knew about the plea deal on November 6th, even though the district attorney is kind of saying that they only knew about it on November the 2nd. But actually they knew about it since August 26th. Just think about that, August 26th, October 26th, and then up until November. So, essentially for 2 months, August, September, October. So 2 full months that they knew about it. So I'll obviously be continuing this series through the timeline in episode 17. I think that's going to be quite an interesting episode. You can go to Patreon for some coverage of what I call the debunking the accessory theory, and I'm doing a 3-part series on that, dealing specifically with 3 aspects: the well site, Kessinger's alibi, and the whole shadow on the driveway controversy. So if you're interested in that, head on to Patreon. That's patreon.com/TCRS. I'm also doing ongoing coverage of the mythology surrounding Van Gogh, which is, you'll be surprised if you follow the coverage, it's actually a true crime saga all of its own. Did he cut off his ear? Did he commit suicide or was he murdered? Was he mad? Who was he? What was going on? What was the motives of the people around him? And in the same way that we can look at Facebook posts of Shanann and lives to see the dynamics of what was going on with her, amazingly enough, we can look 130 years into the past and see through his daily letters and his almost daily paintings exactly what Van Gogh was thinking and all that kind of thing. And one thing that I posted in the previous video was that 30 experts came together, also like over 100 years after his death, to try and definitively diagnose what was wrong with him. And they couldn't really agree, all of these experts. And the world has for so long imagined that Van Gogh was mad, when it turns out that his madness was really down to a drinking problem. And that comes back to this whole thing of people preferring to think the worst possible version. And unfortunately, in terms of the Chris Watts case, in terms of the way the legal eagles prosecuted this case, I think the worst case scenario is the actual scenario. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. If you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.